Welcome back. Today we're opening up a set of sources that analyze something really quite profound. It's this paradox, really, that forces us to question, the very meaning of justice. It's the paradox of penal failure.
Hmm.
When we talk about prisons, pretty much anywhere you look, the critique is often the same, isn't it? They cost a fortune, they don't seem to rehabilitate people effectively,
Huh.
recidivism rates are stubbornly high,
Right.
and they just don't seem to make a dent in the overall crime rate. So we tend to label them an institutional failure.
Yeah, that's the common view.
But here's the twist. What if that constant documented failure, the high number of repeat offenders, the sheer cost and inefficiency, what if that was actually the system's strange, maybe even secret, but highly effective success?
That's the really unsettling question, isn't it? And it's what we're diving into.
Exactly. That's the core question driving this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going through a stack of historical texts, philosophical work, leaning heavily on some foundational stuff about power and punishment
Hmm.
to really analyze this historical link between what the sources call illegalities and delinquency. Our mission really is to get past the stated goal of the prison system, stopping crime and try to understand its surprising, maybe even strategic function, how it manages resistance in a way.
And looking at it historically, going back almost 200 years, it gives you this kind of chilling shortcut to understanding maybe how things still operate today.
Yeah, it does.
And I think the immediate thing for you, the listener, to
Yeah.
grasp is just how old this critique is. This isn't some modern, 21st century idea.
Right.
The denouncement of the prison as the great failure of penal justice. Well, that didn't take centuries to bubble up. It happened almost right away. Basically, as soon as the penitentiary system got widely implemented, say, between 1820 and 1845,
Wow.
the very people who were building these systems, they almost immediately saw the flaws.
That's such a short time frame. You kind of imagine these institutions evolving over long periods, but you're saying the builders barely finished the walls before people were shouting that the whole thing was flawed.
Pretty much, yeah. The history here isn't this neat linear story of constant improvement and success, which is often the narrative we get fed.
Right, the march of progress idea.
Exactly. The historical record actually shows this constant cycle. Big reform projects get launched, lots of fanfare, the new penitentiary method gets put in place, and then boom, almost instantly its failure is recognized, documented. But the core structure, it just
Yeah.
stays.
So the basic design they were criticizing way back in 1845, the isolation, the lack of real job training or education, the fact that so many people came right back, that's fundamentally the same stuff dominating criminal justice debates now.
It really is. The language might have shifted a bit, the jargon changes,
Yeah.
but the actual negative outcomes they documented 2 centuries ago, they're being repeated today, almost point for point. It's uncanny.
Okay, so that is the crucial point then. If these predictable negative outcomes have been known, analyzed, repeated for literally 200 years,
Yeah.
and if this failure costs billions, drains resources, has huge human costs, why does the basic institution of the prison seem so resistant to fundamental change?
Exactly.
That's the question. If the system constantly fails its stated public purpose, then we kind of have to explore this other hypothesis, right? That its actual, maybe hidden strategic purpose is something else entirely. Okay, so let's start with the hard evidence, the proof that the system isn't doing what it says on the tin. The simple, stark inefficiency in reducing crime. The historical analysis we looked at is crystal clear on this.
Mm-hmm.
Pouring massive resources into the prison system did not actually bring down the crime rate. In many cases, crime just stayed level or sometimes even went up, even as more people were being locked away.
And the scale of repression back then, mid-19th century, was just huge, especially relative to the population size.
Yeah.
The analysis we're drawing from focused on France, and it calculated something like 108,000 people were considered to be in a state of flagrant hostility to society.
108,000.
Yeah. And think about the physical response to that.
Right.
You still had things like the scaffold, the iron collar being used,
Right.
plus these 3 massive convict ships, 19 maisons centrales, those are the big central prisons, 86 maisons de justice, hundreds of local jails, police stations.
It's colossal infrastructure, just dedicated purely to control, to containment.
Absolutely. And yet the data showed the overall crime rate just wasn't budging downwards. It's like, as you said, installing this enormous water pump to drain a lake, and the water level just stays the same.
Right. Or maybe even creeps up a bit.
And this leads straight to the most damning historical point. The system of detention itself, according to these sources, actually causes recidivism.
It's not just an unfortunate side effect.
No, it's presented as a predictable mechanism. You go into the system, you're actually more likely to come back. The number of recidivists wasn't going down, it was going up. It created this self-feeding loop.
Let's put a number on that loop because the sources give one. An analysis showed 38% of those leaving the maisons centrales, the big prisons, were convicted again.
38%. That's more than a third.
Yeah. And a third of those got sent back for serious sentences, like on the convict ships. When over a third of your output is essentially, defective product that needs immediate recycling,
Yeah.
you have to start thinking the machine itself is kind of optimized for that failure, don't you?
You really do. And let's dig into the specific 19th century recidivism figures to really get a sense of this self-generating failure.
Yeah.
Between 1828 and 1834, okay, out of about 35,000 general convictions, 7,400 were repeat offenders.
So roughly 1 in 5.
About 1 in 4.7, yeah. And if you look at the petty offenders, the correctionals, similar group size, around 35,000, you had 5,800 recidivists. That's closer to 1 in 6.
So even in that first decade or so of the widespread penitentiary system, it was already failing to reintegrate somewhere between, 16 and 21% of the people it processed. That's a huge drag on society.
It is. And things actually got worse, or the diagnosis got worse, during the July monarchy period, 1835 to 1844. The historical record shows this acceleration. If you aggregate the data, the total number of convicted criminals stayed pretty high, hovering around 7,200 to 7,700 a year.
Okay.
But the proportion recidivists within that group, undeniably rising. Between 35 and 44, the actual number of repeat offenders went up from about 1,486 to 1,951.
Wait a second. So if the total number of convicts only nudged up slightly, but the number of recidivists jumped by nearly 500, that means the pool of new offenders wasn't growing nearly as fast as the pool of repeat offenders. The system was feeding itself by failing the people it already had. The failure rate was outstripping the intake rate.
That's exactly the interpretation the critics made back then. And yeah, it holds up. It was this persistent, growing problem. And the authorities knew it. They had the reports. They saw the trend lines.
But the truly jaw-dropping detail, the place where this stops being just statistics and becomes this concentrated fact, is when you look at specific prisons. We have to talk about Maloon Prison.
Ah, Maloon. Yes.
It really acts as this perfect, horrifying microcosm of the whole system's malfunction, doesn't it?
Maloon is basically Exhibit A. It proves the prison wasn't just failing, it was concentrating failure. The analysis showed that out of just over 1,000 prisoners, there 1,008 to be precise, a staggering 745, were identified as recidivists.
745. That's nearly 3/4 of the entire population.
Yep. Nearly 3/4 had already been through the system and come back. 570 were back for their first return trip, and 175 were already on their second, third, maybe more subsequent sentence.
That's not a correctional facility. That's a manufacturing plant for failure. The system wasn't taking in criminals and spitting out reformed citizens. It was taking in citizens, maybe minor offenders, and churning out career criminals.
Right.
If you walked into Mellon back then, you were basically walking into an environment totally dominated by people the system had already failed or actively damaged.
Precisely. Instead of releasing corrected individuals, the analysis concluded the prison was basically just unleashing a swarm of dangerous delinquents back onto the population.
Yeah.
The sources talk about these, 7,000 principles of crime or corruption spreading through society, actively generated inside the prison walls. The very system designed to reduce disorder was, in fact, generating it through its own day-to-day operations.
Okay, so the numbers clearly show the system is failing its stated goal of reducing crime. So now we have to look inside, right? Understand the mechanism of that failure. Let's move past the stats and look at how the prison actively creates what the sources call a useless, dangerous existence.
Well, the critics back in the 1840s, they really zeroed in on two core systemic flaws that pretty much guaranteed failure. First was this combination of isolation and idleness.
Right.
Inmates are totally cut off from the society they're supposedly being prepared to rejoin. And crucially, they were often denied any truly useful work, any kind of education or skill training that could actually help them earn an honest living when they got out.
But wait, why deny them useful work? Wasn't the whole idea of the penitentiary supposed to be about, quiet reflection and labor that builds character?
Ah, see, that's the gap, isn't it? Between the lofty ideal and the grim reality. The system was built around guarding and punishment, first and foremost, not genuine education or rehabilitation.
Okay.
And that links to the second flaw. The prison structure itself was seen as fundamentally incapable of preparing someone for life outside. The source of material puts it bluntly. It cannot act as a system of education addressed to man reasonably. Basically, the prison environment is so artificial, so removed from normal human interaction and negotiation,
Right.
that whatever lessons you learn inside are actually counterproductive for surviving on the outside.
And this then feeds into this cycle of deep personal injustice, doesn't it? Which just hardens the person. The analysis suggests that the constant feeling of being subjected to arbitrary power inside the prison, the broken promise of reform, the sheer harshness of it all, it leads the prisoner to feel this intense and maybe even justified sense of injustice.
Yeah, they start to see themselves as exposed to suffering that the original sentence, the law itself, never actually intended or ordered. They were supposed to be reformed, but instead they felt neglected, exploited, brutalized by how the system actually ran day to day.
And when that happens, the person stops seeing their own fault, right? They start blaming the whole system. The prisoner becomes habitually angry against everything around him. He sees every agent of authority as an executioner. He no longer thinks that he was guilty. He accuses justice itself.
Exactly. And when you breed that kind of deep-seated systemic rage, the prisoner's character becomes, quote, untamable. It virtually guarantees they'll return to crime once they're released.
Okay, now let's talk about the internal reality, the structural corruption, the fear. You mentioned the staffing ratio earlier.
Oh, yeah, the staffing was a complete joke, which basically guaranteed that genuine discipline, let alone reform, was impossible. The analysis notes, between 1,000 and 1,500 convicts live under the surveillance of between 30 and 40 supervisors.
30 or 40 supervisors for over 1,000 people. That's, what, maybe one guard for every 40 or 50 inmates?
Something like that. It's an impossible situation for any kind of ethical, effective control or guidance.
Yeah, that ratio pretty much ensures the whole system has to run on coercion and fear, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The guards' effectiveness relied almost entirely on informers, on snitching, which
Ah.
just creates this atmosphere of paranoia, total distrust, everything based on deals and transactions rather than actual discipline or learning. And on top of that, the guards themselves were often ex-soldiers, men trained in the trade of guarding malefactors.
So military discipline, basically.
Yeah, which just reinforced this brutal, transactional, us versus them relationship. The system was set up to contain a dangerous enemy, not to guide a flawed citizen back to society.
And then we get to the penal labor aspect,
Oh.
which is maybe the most, I don't know, morally shocking hypocrisy in the whole setup. The sources actually compare it to, well, to slavery and human trafficking.
Yeah, I pull no punches. They say, one inveighs against the slave trade, but are not our prisoners sold, like the slaves, by entrepreneurs and bought by manufacturers? Is this how we teach our prisoners honesty?
Wow. That's devastatingly ironic, isn't it?
It is. The prison, this supposedly moral institution, was actually functioning as an economic engine, selling off inmate labor for profit. The prisoner wasn't learning an honest trade they could use outside. They were just cheap, disposable labor for businesses. It completely undermined any pretense of a moral lesson.
Okay, so that economic reality, that exploitation, it sets the stage for the next critical problem. The prison becomes an organized crime school.
Exactly, by concentrating all these exploited, angry, often quite skilled individuals together. The system actually makes it possible, even encourages the formation of these delinquent networks, associations, gangs, what the source calls antisocial clubs, groups that help each other out, plan future crimes, maintain connections.
So the structure itself breeds organized crime.
It's the perfect incubator. We're talking about large structured groups inside the Maison Centrales, maybe 200, 500, even 1,200 convicts thrown together because it's convenient for work details or dorm assignments or eating arrangements.
Right. The system inadvertently creates the ideal conditions for criminal syndicates to form and network.
Precisely. So imagine a young kid, first offense, maybe not even that serious,
Yeah.
enters this environment. They're not stepping into a place of quiet reflection and reform.
No, they're enrolling in Advanced Criminality 101.
Pretty much. The sources say their education isn't about reform. Their first lesson will be derived from the strict logic of thieves. And their whole moral compass gets twisted. Their first passion will be to frighten the young mind by these monsters that must have been born in the dungeon. This is where that powerful phrase comes from, the barracks of crime.
The barracks of crime, yeah.
The prison doesn't just fail to contain crime. It actively organizes it, refines it, gives it a social structure, leadership, networks,
Yeah.
and then releases it back into the wild, stronger and more coordinated than ever before.
So if the prison is essentially this barracks of crime, what happens when the sentence is up? The gate swings open, what then? You can imagine someone finishing their time, maybe feeling that rage and injustice we talked about, maybe genuinely wanting to turn their life around, only to find that the conditions waiting for them outside almost guarantee they'll end up right back in that same state of rage and desperation.
Yeah, the conditions imposed on freed inmates were absolutely not designed for reintegration. They were designed for ongoing control.
Right.
Ex-prisoners faced this whole battery of post-release restrictions that, frankly, often pushed them straight back into crime. Constant police surveillance was a big one.
Always being watched.
Always. Plus, they were often forced to live in specific locations, banned from certain cities or industrial areas where they might find work. And this is critical. They had to carry a mandatory passport.
A passport, like for travel.
No, more like an internal identity document that clearly stated they had served time. It was basically a label.
So like a scarlet letter, an official document telling every potential boss, every landlord, this person is a known criminal, officially tainted.
Exactly. Why would any employer, thinking rationally, take a chance on someone carrying that mark when they had other applicants? It made finding honest work incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
It's an economic trap designed for failure.
It really was. The surveillance system made sure the ex-convict was perpetually visible, perpetually suspect. And we have this really powerful, specific story illustrating this, recorded in the Gazette des Tribunaux newspaper back in 1847. It's about a worker convicted years earlier, not for theft or violence, but for joining a workers' association, basically a political offense.
Okay, so a relatively minor thing by today's standards, maybe. He gets out, wants to work. What happens?
He tries to go back to his trade. He was a gilder in the city of Rouen. But the moment he tries to settle down, the surveillance kicks in. He's constantly watched. He tries to move, maybe go somewhere he hasn't known, find work elsewhere. The police actively refused him permission to leave Rouen. They confined him there.
Trap.
Completely trapped. Couldn't earn a living, nothing to do. He was driven, in the words of the report, by hunger and poverty, right back towards utter destitution.
And his own words, they captured his words in the sources, didn't they? They're just heartbreaking because they show the total breakdown.
They are. He said he was reduced to working in the cemeteries, digging graves maybe, for just 14 sous a day, which was basically nothing.
14 sous. How much was that, really?
Well, to give you an idea, the sources note he needed more than 2 pounds of bread a day just to survive, and that cost 5 sous a pound.
So 10 sous just for bread.
Yeah, over 2/3 of his tiny daily wage gone just for basic bread, leaving almost nothing for rent, clothes, anything else. It was an economically impossible situation.
And he said it himself, didn't he? I was driven to despair. I wanted to become an honest man again. The surveillance plunged me back into misfortune.
Exactly. Legally free, but functionally trapped. Couldn't get work, couldn't support himself. Inevitably, he was driven into vagrancy, probably begging, and ultimately back to crime. Recidivism. The system didn't just fail him, it actively broke him. Deliberately, you could argue.
And that story, that individual tragedy, it connects back to the wider social impact, right? The prison doesn't just make individual repeat offenders through surveillance and economic traps.
No, it goes further. It actively, though indirectly, generates widespread societal poverty. And by doing that, it ensures there's always a fresh supply of future delinquents.
It's the systemic domino effect, starting with the family. The historical analysis points out that the same legal order that sends, say, the father of the family to prison simultaneously condemns the rest of the family to destitution because their main source of income is just gone.
Yes, and the predictable outcome is this ripple effect of systemic poverty. The analysis suggests this process often leads the mother into prostitution just to survive. The children end up abandoned or on the streets.
Oh, God.
The whole family to vagabondage and begging. And this is a really critical insight from the source. This is the mechanism by which the system guarantees the constant replenishment of the so-called delinquent class.
Wow.
It perpetually justifies its own existence, the need for more prisons, more control. The failure of reform, paradoxically, becomes a strategic success for the institution's own survival and growth.
Okay, so let's recap. We've established this overwhelming historical case against the prison. It's incredibly expensive. It guarantees high recidivism rates. It actively organizes crime within its walls, the barracks of crime idea.
Right.
And it ensures the replacement of the criminal class by destroying families and creating destitution. The evidence for its failure, its inefficiency at its stated goal, seems devastating. So, the big question remains. If this failure was so glaringly obvious for a century and a half, why did this penitentiary technique, as the sources call it, survive? Why didn't they just scrap it and try something radically different?
That really is the central structural question, isn't it? And the sources suggest that the answer to all those chronic criticisms, too expensive, doesn't work, makes things worse, was always bizarrely the same.
Hmm.
You just need to reintroduce the core principles of the penitentiary technique, but do it better this time.
So when critics said this system is failing, the response was never, okay, let's try something else, but always, we just need to implement the existing system more rigorously, more perfectly.
Exactly. The failure wasn't seen as a failure of the concept, but merely a failure of execution. And that failure of execution then became the justification for its own constant renewal. We just need more discipline, more control, more of the same.
It sounds like having a computer program that keeps crashing, but instead of rewriting the faulty code, you just keep reinstalling the same buggy software over and over, hoping it'll work this time. Why were they so resistant to genuine change?
Well, because the prison itself, the building with walls and bars, was only one piece of a much bigger puzzle, the carceral system.
Ah, okay.
This system is this complex web. It's much more than just the physical prison. It includes the staff, the regulations, but also the knowledge produced about prisoners, the disciplines involved, the ideologies surrounding it. To understand why it persisted despite its failures, we need to unpack the 6 key elements that define this broader system's true function, which went way beyond just locking people up.
Okay, right. Let's break down these 6 elements. This feels like where we get to the core operating system of this whole thing. It might get a bit jargon heavy, but the insight seems crucial.
Okay. So first, you have the basic disciplinary element. That's the rules, the isolation, the rigid schedules, all designed to control the body, instill obedience. Pretty
So
straightforward.
it's raw for prison stuff.
Yeah. Second, there's what the source calls the element of superpower. Now, this isn't just about physical force. It's more about the system's unique ability to produce seemingly objective scientific knowledge about the criminal.
Ah, okay.
The prison becomes this kind of laboratory that observes, classifies, and
Yeah.
ultimately defines the delinquent type. It pathologizes the individual.
So it's not just punishing the act, it's manufacturing the identity of the criminal, making them into an object that can be measured, studied, and therefore managed.
Precisely. Third element, the technique of auxiliary knowledge, or rationality. This is all the bureaucratic machinery that surrounds the prison. The social workers, psychologists, criminologists, parole boards, even the wardens writing reports. Their job is to take the knowledge produced by that superpower element and apply techniques to manage the individual based on that classification.
The administrator layer.
Yes. Fourth, the system inherently contains the de facto reintroduction of increased criminality, what's termed the inverse effect. This is acknowledging the built-in reality that the system actually produces the very thing it's supposed to destroy. It creates recidivism.
And they knew this. The sources make it clear they knew the system was actively breeding more crime, but they kept the system going anyway.
Fifth element, the constant repetition of the reform ideal. Every few years, new reformers pop up, maybe with slightly different terminology, promising to finally fix the prison by making it more like its ideal penitentiary self. This cycle keeps the public, and maybe even the administrators, believing that improvement is possible within the existing framework.
It keeps the hope alive, even if it's based on repeating past failures.
Right. And finally, sixth, the ideological element of utopian duplication. This is a bit more abstract, but it's the underlying belief that if the prison fails, it's not the prison's fault. It's because society outside the prison isn't orderly or disciplined enough. The prison is this perfect, rational utopia in theory, and its failure is blamed on the messy reality outside its walls.
So the failure gets externalized. It's not the prison's design, it's society's fault.
Exactly. So the big takeaway here is that the prison survived, not because it successfully reformed people or reduced crime, but because it was embedded in this much larger, highly functional carceral system that was designed, perhaps unconsciously at first, to achieve something else entirely.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about justice or discipline in the simple sense.
Okay, so what was that something else?
Right. This brings us to the core thesis, the real aha moment in the analysis. The prison's obvious failure doesn't actually miss its target. It hits a different, perhaps unstated strategic target. It succeeds in producing one specific, contained type of illegality delinquency in the midst of all sorts of other forms of rule breaking. And this specific type, delinquency, is relatively easy to isolate, to monitor, to put under the spotlight of surveillance, and to organize as this relatively enclosed but penetrable milieu.
Right. We need to really clarify this distinction the sources make because it feels like the absolute pivot point, the difference between illegalities with a capital I and delinquency with a capital D.
Yes. So illegalities in this framework refers to all the broad, diffuse ways people might resist or break the law. Think about things like widespread tax evasion, political protests that challenge authority, workers forming illegal unions, maybe poaching or smuggling common among the poor. These forms are potentially dangerous to the established power structure precisely because they are widespread, sometimes political, and hard to pin down and control.
Like a kind of generalized resistance maybe simmering under the surface.
Exactly. Now, delinquency, on the other hand, is the specific, criminalized, isolated, and often highly organized form of illegality that the prison system itself helps to create and define. Think of illegalities as maybe a kind of fog, diffuse, everywhere, hard to fight directly. Delinquency is more like a specific fire that's been contained within a fire pit. It's visible, you know where it is, you can manage it, maybe even use it.
Okay. So the penal system says it views delinquency as the worst, most harmful form of illegality, and its job is to stamp it out through prison.
Right, that's the official line.
But the argument here is that the very act of confining, defining, and organizing delinquency actually makes it controllable and, crucially, maybe even politically useful.
Precisely. Delinquency isn't just any crime, it's an illegality that the whole carceral system is invested in. It's been segmented, isolated, studied, organized. It ends up playing this instrumental role in relation to those more general, potentially more threatening illegalities.
So the system actually succeeds extremely well in producing delinquency. That's the mind-bending part. The old idea that prison eliminates crime needs to be replaced, or at least challenged, by this hypothesis that the prison has actually succeeded remarkably well in producing this specific, manageable, pathologized subject, the delinquent.
Yes, that pathologized subject, the recognizable career criminal, the type defined by the prison system itself, is ultimately made politically or economically less dangerous than that broad, potentially rebellious, generalized illegality.
How so?
Well, by channeling various forms of resistance and law-breaking into this specific, identifiable, constantly monitored form of delinquency, it becomes much easier for authorities to manage the overall political landscape. The focus shifts away from maybe systemic injustices or widespread discontent.
Onto the much more manageable problem of the bad individual, the known delinquent.
Exactly. And this creates a reinforcement mechanism. The prison system creates and reinforces delinquency, making the delinquent visible, known, tracked. This, in turn, allows authorities to sort of solidify a hierarchy among different kinds of illegalities. Meaning, by focusing intense surveillance, media attention, political rhetoric, and control measures on this managed group of visible, pathologized delinquents, the guys coming out of Mellon again and again.
Right.
The authorities can implicitly or explicitly allow other forms of illegality, perhaps ones that are less threatening to the economic or political power structure, like certain types of corporate crime maybe, or political corruption, to persist with less scrutiny. It acts as a kind of strategic diversion.
Wow. So the real success of the prison, in this view, within the constant struggle around law and rule breaking, has been to specify, isolate, and ultimately manage this contained form of illegality called delinquency.
That's the core argument. And that is why, according to this analysis, after a century and a half of documented, consistent failures in reducing overall crime or reforming individuals, the prison system itself still exists and is so incredibly difficult to get rid of.
Because it produces the controlled problem it was, perhaps inadvertently at first, designed to create. And there's this deep reluctance to dispense with that function. #tag outro. Well, this has been, truly an unsettling, but I think really essential deep dive. We started with this picture of a system that everyone for centuries has basically denounced as a failure. Huge costs, the barracks of crime, that shocking 38% recidivism rate. And we end with this radical reinterpretation that the system's actual function, its hidden success, was maybe never about eliminating general resistance to law, but about isolating, organizing, and managing a specific, contained, and ultimately useful subset of illegal action called delinquency.
Yeah, the historical record viewed this way suggests the prison survived its own constant, well-documented failure precisely because that failure served this powerful strategic purpose in managing social and political dissent. By creating these differentiated, controlled, pathologized subjects,
Right.
it effectively diverted political energy and resources away from those diffuse, maybe structural illegalities, and focused them onto the contained, individualized problem of the delinquent.
So this raises a really critical question for you, the listener, to think about today. When you look at modern prisons, modern criminal justice systems, are you just seeing the latest chapter in the long, sad history of failed reform efforts?
Or are you actually witnessing the continued quiet success of the broader carceral system in fulfilling its secondary strategic function? Producing and managing this differentiated, controlled group of supervised subjects, the pathologized delinquent who might be, in the grand scheme of things, politically less threatening than a more generalized, unmanaged resistance to the status quo.
The source material really suggests that the prison as an institution survived for a century and a half, maybe longer, by constantly generating the very problems it was supposedly built to prevent. So here's a final thought to leave you with. What aspect of our current society, maybe a system or an institution today, seems to be maintained not despite its obvious inefficiencies, its poor results, its high costs, but maybe, just maybe, because of the specific controlled problems it successfully creates and manages?
Hmm.
It really encourages us to look beyond the stated purpose of our institutions and focus instead on their persistent practical outcomes. What are they actually doing?